You are like a song. By herself my waiting girl dreams.
That was a line from a poem that was generated by a computer program in 1982. The programmer was today's guest, Professor Mike Sharples. You're listening to The Science of Creativity. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Sawyer. Professor Sharples has been studying computers and creativity for over 40 years. He's an expert in education, technology, and innovation. His 2022 book is called Story Machines: How Computers Have Become Creative Writers. I'm delighted to have Professor Mike Sharples on The Science of Creativity. Mike, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you. I'm really looking forward to it.
You've been studying computers and creativity since the 1970s. So tell us a little bit about your story. How did you first get involved with computers and creativity?
I've always been fascinated by language as long as I can remember. I remember as a child being intrigued by the shape of letters. And then I've also had an interest in technology. And I went as a student to study computer science. And as I was doing it, I discovered something called generative grammars. And it was a kind of revelation to me that grammars were not just something that a teacher uses to grade your essays, but they could actually be productive, creative, that you had a set of rules that you could control that could generate poems or texts or even stories, and that you could add them to a computer program. And so I got fascinated by this idea of computational creativity, of computers as story generators, and what they could do, and equally important, what they couldn't do.
When was the first time that you actually saw a computer tell a story, or was it when you programmed the computer, or were there already computers available?
I think it probably was when I was studying computer science and I heard about this program called ELIZA by Joe Weizenbaum. And ELIZA was a very early chatbot. It simulated a psychotherapist and you could have a conversation with it. And that conversation was in just ordinary language. You weren't using computer code. And it spoke back to you. It wrote back to you. And this idea of a conversational partner I found fascinating. So I wanted to know how it worked, being a computer scientist. And so I wrote my own chatbots. And then those turned into a program for translating French into English, and then programs for generating poems and stories.
Well, and then you started graduate school and you got your PhD in 1984 with the title was Cognition, Computers, and Creative Writing. Where did you get the idea to start a graduate program that you could actually study this thing?
Well, when I left as a computer science graduate, I actually wanted nothing else to do with computing, and I spent a year as a community drama worker. And then I kind of got enticed back into academia. And I turned up at the AI department in Edinburgh with the idea of designing an environment for children to be able to explore, but I wasn't sure what. And initially, it was around exploring physics, but the computers at the time just weren't up to physics modeling. And so I went back to this fascination I had of language. And nobody else in the AI department was doing work on computers and language generation. But I persuaded supervisors to take me on for their PhD. And I set out on this journey to design tools that would help children to explore language and particularly to develop their skills of creative writing. And these were average ability children, aged 11, who didn't see themselves as creative writers. And I wanted to give them a tool where they could explore the structure of language, they could put together narratives and descriptions, and they could be creative with the aid of a computer. So the computer wasn't going to take over. They were going to be in charge, and they could use the computer as a tool for creativity. And it worked. The children that I worked with were fascinated by this idea of computational creativity, of computers creating stories, and they generated little poems, stories, computer games using the tools that I'd designed.
Ah, that's fascinating. So your interest was, I guess you could say it was in people composing stories or teaching these children how to write good stories. Is that right?
That's right. And also taking a creative perspective, because to these children, they weren't great writers. And at that kind of age, they're starting to think about the writing that they're doing. And the more they think, the worse they get. And I wanted to try and overcome this barrier where they were just worrying about what they were writing and getting marked down in school for doing that. So I wanted to take this creative perspective and give them tools that would enhance their creativity, not block it. And yeah, they really enjoyed and were able to. This was some of the most advanced technology of the time. They were able to work with it and to be able to create little stories, little poems that satisfied them and even got published in school magazines.
Well, how did that happen? Could you say a little bit more? How did the computer program help those children?
Okay, so there were a number of different tools that I used. One of them was this idea of creating a template for generating language. So I initially did it without a computer at all. I just put words into a box, and they could choose whatever words they wanted to and put them into a box. And then they pulled them out at random. And I've laid them on the table in a line. And of course, they didn't make much sense. And so we said, well, then, okay, how do you make sense out of those words? Well, you have to put them in the right order. What's the right order? And so with the children, we explored what's the right order of words. How could you then put words into different boxes, what you would call parts of speech, and then draw these out to make little poems or sentences that made more sense. And then we built up from there. We had a very early text-based computer game where they could write descriptions of rooms in a haunted house. And then they could play that game on the computer by exploring those rooms and meeting characters. And they turned these descriptions into stories. So I gave the children a set of tools where they could explore language and develop themselves as creative writers.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. So these computers were not actually generating the stories, but they were providing tools that would help the children learn to generate good stories. Is that right?
Absolutely. So the children were in charge of what vocabulary they used, what words, what sentence patterns they used. And with this little game we developed, they could write the descriptions of the rooms in a haunted house, the characters, and then the computer, if you like, orchestrated them. The computer helped to turn this into a story which they could then rewrite and develop themselves. So it was really a dance, a dialogue between the children and the computer.
Oh, a dialogue of creative writing.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes. And it wasn't that the computer was doing the creative writing or the children, it was both of them together. And the children were giving the resources, the computer was coming back with a draft story, the children were developing that. So it was an interaction between the children and the computer.
It's something that I really like about your research in general is that you always stay connected with the person, the human being, as the creator. And you're always thinking about the computer as a partner, I guess, or maybe the human being is the guide. I'm thinking about your studies of human people. I say human writers. I should just say writers, but you did research on writers to find out how they create and what their creative process was. And in 1999, you published a book called How We Write. So tell us about that. How did you actually study these writers and how they create?
After my PhD, I realized that I needed to know more about the writing process. And at that time, it was still something of a mystery. How did creative writers work? How did these ideas and words well up in their minds? And so I started with the way that many researchers in cognitive science start by interviewing creative writers and looking at published interviews with creative writers to try and understand what was the creative writing process. And I rapidly realized there wasn't one creative writing process. There are many different processes, and almost each successful writer had a different personal way of writing. But there was something in common about that. And the first thing is that they tend to start with a set of constraints. It could just be an idea that they have. If it's a murder mystery story, it is a corpse that is discovered. You start off with a constraint, and then you come to generate ideas. And if you're just generating those ideas in your head as a writer, you can very fluidly move between what's been called high and low focus thinking. So low focus thinking is kind of dreaming, going with the flow, letting ideas pop into your head. And high focus thinking is about reorganizing them, planning, structuring. And you can do that quite fluidly in your head. But once you try to put the words down onto paper, then you can't be doing the two at the same time. You can't be writing and reflecting at the same time. And so it has to be a sequence. It has to be a rhythm of engaged writing and reflecting. And different authors have different rhythms. So some authors, like Charles Dickens, would write in the morning and then reflect in the afternoon. Some writers would get into the flow and write for days on end, and then look over and then try and produce a different draft. So different authors had different rhythms of writing. And again, that fascinated me because I wondered whether you could then start to design an AI program that would simulate that mental process, those rhythms of writing. And so I worked with colleagues at the University of Sussex in School of Cognitive and Computing Sciences on designing what we called a writer's assistant, and also working with PhD students on story generating. So these were some of the very earliest generative AI story generating programs. And particularly a colleague of mine, Rafael Perez, has gone on to develop a whole career around automated story generation and automated creativity.
Oh, there's so much I want to ask you to follow up, and I hope we get to all of this. So I heard you talking about two different modes of thought, I guess you will. These are creative writers or maybe professional writers, and they have a rhythm where they alternate between these two modes of thought. So then you tried to model that with a computer program. So does that mean the computer also has two different modes of working or modes of thinking, if you will?
Yes, and that was really the pioneering work that Raphael did. So he designed a program that modeled the creative process of human writers based on this model of writing that I had developed, this engagement and reflection model. And so it has two different modes. With the engaged mode, what it does is it does basically what a child does. It says, here's an action, and then what happens next, and what happens next, and what happens next. And you can write a whole story like that. That's the way children tell stories. I went to the park, and then I played with my friends, and then I bought an ice cream, and then I saw mummy, and then I came home, and so on. That's the sort of engaged way of writing. And then the reflective way of writing is to then look back over what you've written, reflect on it, and then say, what's missing? How could you improve it? What will you add? And Raphael developed a computer program called Mexica, which tells stories about the ancient inhabitants of Mexico that's based on this engagement and reflection model. So it can move between these two modes. And It's a model of the human processes of writing, a model that you can explore, you can play with, you can get it to be more or less creative, more or less reflective. And it's been his career in developing this model of writing on a computer.
I'd like to play an audio clip that you provided, and this is a story that was generated by Mexica and was polished up, I guess you'd say, by ChatGPT. And now we have an automatic voice generator that's going to read it for us.
In the grand city of Tenochtitlan, there lived a warrior known as Jaguar Knight, a fierce protector of his people. In the same city resided a noble princess, known for her wisdom and grace. One day, Tlaloc, the god of rain, grew furious and unleashed a storm upon the land.
Oh, that is fascinating. Yeah, I would like to talk a lot more about, I guess, I would say Mexica, Mexica. You pronounce Mexica, is that right?
That's how he pronounces it. Yeah.
And that's where, yeah, you talk a lot about that in your book called Story Machines. And one thing I was fascinated by is you've talked about engagement. I guess that's one mode of thought, and then reflection being the other one. And Mexica has this ability to evaluate its own stories. And that's, I guess, the reflection, right? So how does Mexica evaluate its own stories? How does it decide whether, I guess, it's a good one or a bad one, or if it needs this or that particular development? How does it do that?
Well, it starts with a story action. So with Mexico, it's about the ancient inhabitants of Mexico. So it might start with an event like Princess Healed Jaguar Knight. And then it moves on from there. So what happened next? An enemy kidnapped the princess. The enemy attacked the princess. Jaguar Knight looked for the princess. So it creates a story outline based on these events. And then at some point it stops. It either stops because it's kind of run out of ideas, it's reached the computer equivalent of a writer's block, or it stops just because it's been going on too long and it needs to move over to the other mode. And then it fills in the gaps. So, for example, if it started with Princess Healed Jaguar Knight, it would then reflect and ask itself the equivalent of the question, why? Why did the princess heal Jaguar Knight? What had happened to Jaguar Knight? And anyway, who are Princess and Jaguar Knight? So it goes back and introduces the characters, indicates why Jaguar Knight needed to be healed, and then it starts filling in the gaps at other points in the story. And it also follows a story arc. So the idea of a story arc, and this is something that professional writers use, is that you've got to increase and diffuse tension. And so it chooses actions that will build up that tension, for instance, to a battle or to the princess being captured and then being rescued, and then diffusing that tension. And then finally, it's got to find an ending. And one of the things it can do is go to previous stories to find endings and then adapt them into the current situation. So it's quite a complex piece of software that's trying to model all of these processes that creative writers go through. I like to look on it rather in the way that a meteorologist might have a climate model. So with a climate model, you can play what if. What would happen if you reduced carbon emissions? What would happen if the ice caps melted? Well, with this Mexican model, you can do the same with creative writing. What would happen if you were more in a flow state? What would happen if you were more reflective? What would happen if you didn't write about ancient Mexico, but you wrote about a detective story set in modern times? So you can play lots of what would happen ifs, and you have control over the creative process in a way that you don't have that sort of control, for example, with modern generative AI.
You've described in your book that Mexica, it generates the story structure, I think you could say, but it doesn't necessarily generate all the words that tell the story. Is that right? Tell us a little bit about that.
That's right. There was a good reason for that, which is that if you're trying to model the mind of a writer, you don't want to get too obsessed with the surface text. There are plenty of programs nowadays, like ChatGPT, that can produce very polished, grammatically correct language. But with these story-generating models, you want to understand at a deeper level what it is that they're doing in terms of structuring a story. So it produces a story outline. And I indicated the type of story outline: princess heel, jaguar knight, enemy kidnapped princess, enemy reacted by attacking princess. Those story outlines then provide the sort of skeleton of the story. The program can then add further story elements. It can see how the story elements relate to each other. And once it has produced a coherent story, then a program like ChatGPT can clothe that story outline with a polished text. And so it's working at a different level to a generative AI program such as ChatGPT. It's working with a story structure, a story skeleton, and trying to understand the creative process for creating that.
And your research with human writers, you've said that this is how they create, right? That they come up with that underlying structure and then they add the words later, I guess.
One of the things I've discovered about human creative writers is that there are many ways of writing. Certainly for academic writing, that tends to be the way that you do it, that you create a first draft, perhaps, and then you reflect on it, and then you improve it. Or if you're a story writer, you could just be writing page by page, generating that page, revising it, going on to the next page. There are even some celebrated professional writers like Isaac Asimov who were able to write an entire short story just in that engaged mode. He was such an accomplished writer. He said he never had a moment of writer's block, but he's pretty exceptional. Most of us as writers have to go through this process of engagement and reflection. We do it really without thinking too much. We write a bit, we look at it, we revise it, we write some more, and we have different rhythms of writing. And that's what we're trying to simulate with a program like Mexica.
In your book, Story Machines, you describe something called a story grammar. And I think Mexica is a little different from a story grammar. So what do you mean by story grammar?
So story grammars were one of the earliest ways that computer scientists devised for generating stories, because one of the fascinating things about the history of story generation is that some of the most famous computer scientists and the most famous authors have been just captivated by this idea of a machine generating stories. Alan Turing, for example, was interested in this from the very earliest days. And so a story grammar was developed in the 1970s as a way of trying to describe the structure of a story. And if you can imagine a grammar that describes the structure of a sentence, like article, adjective, noun, verb, preposition, article, noun, describing the structure of a sentence, then you take that up a level to the structure of a story. So at the very minimum, a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But then the beginning has introducing the characters, introducing the setting, the first action, and so on. And way back in the 19th century, writers realized that stories had this structure, but it wasn't until the 1970s and computers came along that computer scientists and linguists started to mechanize this story structure. And so it was a way of describing, but also generating the structure overall of a story. The problem is, it's not how human writers work. We don't have this grand generative story grammar in our heads, which we use to then produce parts of a story. We get stuck in. As I say, we get into a flow state, we generate some words, some actions, and then we reflect, and then we go back to generating. So story grammars were an early way of describing the structure of stories, but they weren't really a good way of understanding how human writers worked to create stories or poems.
So the story grammar is the map of the entire story, so all the way from the beginning to the end. And you would say human writers don't do that. They don't get out a piece of paper and draw the flow chart of how their story is going to go and then just execute their flow chart, right? Because the structure of the story emerges from the process.
Exactly. And if you have interviews with writers, that's exactly what they say. Many writers just don't know how their story is going to be structured. They just get into the flow of the story, and the story takes them over. They find themselves engaged with the characters and then describing those characters and how they interact, and the story emerges from that creative interactive process. It's not that they have a complete map of a story in their heads at the start. That's not how creative writers in general work.
Now, if you're talking about a computer program that is writing or generating a structure of a story, whether it's generating the text, it seems like a computer, that wouldn't happen. A computer wouldn't have a character that takes over the story. I hear a lot of writers talking about like a dialogue, or they believe that the characters actually do have their own intentions and their own beliefs. Is there any equivalent to that in any of the computer programs you know about?
Yes. So you can then start not just to model the mind of a writer, but you can also model what's called a story world. And a good example of that is a computer game. So a computer game is a story world on a computer. So if you've got an interactive game like, say, The Sims or SimCity, you've got a world there with simulated characters interacting. And those simulated characters, when they come up against each other, hold computer-generated conversations. And that's a story world. What you can do is you can insert some of those sorts of story worlds into a computer-generated story, so that you not only have events that are happening, you also have simulated interactions, which then cause pieces of dialogue. So you're starting to take what Mexico did with this story outline, and you insert into it a story world where these characters can meet and interact. And now it's getting richer, more complex, and more exciting, because you're kind of merging this idea of story generation with world building.
Oh, that is fascinating. So when you say story world, I guess you would include in that a lot of today's computer games where you can explore for hours, tens of hours, this universe that the game designers, is that what you would call a story world?
Absolutely. So, something like Grand Theft Auto now is a pretty rich story world. You can meet characters. Most computer games are designed for conflict, but they don't need to be. You can see them as worlds in which characters can meet and can interact and can converse. And what I think is going to happen pretty soon, where you've got story worlds meeting generative AI, is that you're going to have interactive sitcoms, interactive streaming programs where you can not only watch a computer-generated movie, for example, but you can interact with it. You can be a character in that, and you can converse with the other characters. You can get immersed into that story world. So I think pretty soon you're going to get a merging of interactive computer games and story generation. And that's going to be fascinating because they're going to be both immersive and highly addictive.
Computer games, the designers, in a way, they are structuring a story, I guess you will. They are thinking about, as you play a game over 10 or 20 hours, that the experience will have some sort of narrative structure. I've heard this word narratology. What could you say about that? How these designers come up with these story worlds?
That's right. And I think the earliest story worlds were essentially just places where characters met, and the human player then provided the narrative of it. What's starting to happen now is you've got stories embedded into the games themselves. And I mentioned about narrative development, story arcs, trying to work out a good ending, something that's called tellability. So tellability is a story something that you would really want to tell to yourself or to someone else? And so you can build all of these things into a computer game. You can build story arcs that increase tension and resolve that tension, provide good endings. You can make the computer games more tellable as stories. And you can make them episodic so that instead of playing for 20 hours at a time, you might play them for an hour, just as if you were watching a box set. You might play them for an hour, and then you get a cliffhanger, and then it stops, and you come back the next time. So I think, as I say, you're going to get sort of box sets of TV-type stories, streaming-type stories, merging with computer games. And some of these, this work that's been done on automated storytelling is really going to influence the world of computer games.
Well, you mentioned Grand Theft Auto. Could you give an example of a game that you think does a really good job of creating a story world or creating a narrative experience?
I don't think we've got there yet. And I can't say I'm an expert in narrative computer games. What's happened really up until now is that computer game companies have been competing on the quality of their visual images, on how realistic the characters look, how realistic the world looks. They haven't really been competing on the story quality, and that's only just starting now. I think there are games such as Civilization. There's a new version of that where apparently it's based around London and around building up the city of London. So you can start to tell stories within the game, but I'm not enough of an expert to know what's the state of the art in narrative-based, story-based computer games, but I know they're coming and I know they're being developed, and that generative AI, but also the type of symbolic AI that Raphael and others have been working with are going to be central to that.
It seems like a huge challenge to design a game like that because you want the game player to feel that they have a creative options to influence the narrative that's unfolding. You don't want every player to experience it just like you're sitting there inside of a movie that's already been scripted. So there's, I guess, just like at the beginning of our interview, if you're designing the game very well, then the player will be like a co-author with the computer of the narrative experience of playing the game.
Absolutely. And that's the real challenge in terms of games design, because you don't want playing the game to be a chore. Going back to story grammars, you don't want to have game players creating a story grammar before they can play the game. It's got to be an immersive flow type experience, but also, it's got to have a story arc. It's got to increase tension, resolve that tension, and you as a player have to feel that you are participating in that. You are affecting not just the interaction of the characters, but you're influencing, affecting the story itself. If it was a detective type story, you might be the detective who discovers the body. And then you have to recruit other people. You have to chase back to try and find out who the murderer was. So you have to feel that you are a participant, not only in the interaction, but also in the unfolding story. And how to design those story-based computer games is going to be a real skill, and it's going to bring in all of these issues that we've talked about around tellability, around story arcs, around engagement and reflection.
We've talked a lot about computers and creativity in writing, and somehow we haven't talked at all about ChatGPT. So, our large language models. So that's fascinating to me that there's so much involved. So yeah, let's turn to ChatGPT. Does it do anything like what we've been talking about?
So I think the first thing to say is that there are two broad types of AI. The first type is symbolic AI, and that's what I've been talking about so far, where you explicitly model, in this case, the process of story generation. And the great advantage of symbolic AI is that you have an explicit model. You can play with it. You can say, what would happen if? What happens if I take out this module and put in that module? What happens if I tweak this bit? What happens if I add this new character? You can be exploring at all levels the structure of how it works. But it takes a long time and a lot of effort to build that type of symbolic model of creativity. The other type of AI is the large language model, of which ChatGPT is one example. And what that has done is essentially ingested billions of pieces of text and then used that to generate further text of a given type, of a given style. So you can specify the style. So you can say, you could ask it to write a story outline for you. I've tried doing that. You can ask it to write a chapter of a novel for you, and it will do a creditable job. Not a great job. At the moment, its productions are pretty mediocre, but it can do it. But what it can't do is then go into this reflective mode to reflect on the structure of what it's doing, and it can't explain how it does it. So it's a black box that you're working with. It's a very powerful black box. It can create, believable looking, well-structured text, but you can't look inside its process. You can't look inside its simulated mind to say what's going on there, what are the structures you're working with, and how could they be different. So what I'm hoping is that you're going to be able to put the two types of AI together. And you mentioned using Mythica to generate a story outline and then ChatGPT to clothe that with words so that it produced a readable story. And I think those kinds of hybrid symbolic and neural network generative AI are going to be the future.
So the symbolic AI writer comes up with the bones of the story or the overall structure of the story, and then ChatGPT is better at coming up with words, sentences that are interesting to read. Is that fair to say?
That's one way of doing it, yeah. So you get symbolic AI to create the story structure and having control over that story structure, and then clothing that story structure with text that follows the flow, the sequence of story elements. There are other ways you can do it. I mentioned the story worlds. So you can have story worlds that are in part generated by programs like ChatGPT that you then interact with, but then can call on symbolic AI, for example, to solve problems within that story world. So there are different ways of mixing together symbolic and generative neural AI. And it's very much state of the art at the moment, how you can put these two types of AI together.
It sounds like, I agree, the cutting edge. And with ChatGPT, it seems like you can't get this kind of understanding of the story structure. Say, for example, there's a version of Mexica that recognizes when it reaches an impasse, when it gets to a point where the story, I guess, isn't making sense, or the outline isn't able to resolve in a plot, or it's not coherent. How would a program like Mexica be able to detect when it's stuck?
So that's absolutely right. So there are different ways it can detect when it's stuck. One way is that it follows a sequence of story actions, and each story action has a cause or a precondition, and it has a consequence. And that consequence then becomes a precondition for the next story action. So if it produces a story action, which then doesn't have another one that can follow on, it then reaches an impasse. And it then has to reflect, do I need to change this story action? Do I need to alter the sequence? And it can do that. It can find ways to break that impasse. Or it can be at the end of a story arc. So it's created tension, a fight or a battle or a rescue. It's resolved that, perhaps two lovers coming together after a battle. And then it's got to find a way just of rounding off that story. So again, it can do that. It can look for previous stories, or it can take elements of those two characters, for instance, a conflict between those two characters, as a way of rounding off the story. So it's capable of reflecting on its own structure, it's capable of reflecting on what's missing, and then resolving that in a way that at the moment a program like ChatGPT can't do.
With today's AI, we'll often hear about explainability, or the fact that ChatGPT or large language models, they aren't able to explain how they came up with what they did. They can't explain why they made a decision or what factors they took into account. And the way you're describing a symbolic AI program, it sounds highly explainable. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. It can explain its processes. And I think that's what makes it powerful in a different way, because it then becomes a model that you can work with. And I talked about meteorology and climate models. ChatGPT is a little like a weather forecasting program, where you take the current weather and what's gone before, and you predict what's going to come next with the weather. And that's great. That's really useful. And you've got more and more powerful weather forecasting systems. And ChatGPT is a bit like that. But you also, as a meteorologist, want climate models, where you're not just forecasting what comes next, but you're trying to understand climate, the whole climate system, and to say what would happen if we reduce carbon emissions, what would happen if the ice caps melted. And that's more like symbolic AI. You need to put in all of these different elements and see how they interact. Now, a meteorologist needs both. It needs a climate model, and a meteorologist also needs a weather forecasting tool. And that's, I think, how AI and creativity is going to work in the future. You're going to put those two different types of system together.
At the beginning of our interview, you talked about some of your early research where you could use these computer story generators to help children learn how to tell stories. And as you're talking about this issue of explainability, it seems to me like the ChatGPT would not be very effective at helping a child learn, because ChatGPT can't explain what it's done. Is that fair to say?
I think a child could and can use a program like ChatGPT for exploring language and creativity. And I'll say a couple of ways that you could do it. Firstly, a child or an adult who wants to understand about story writing could ask ChatGPT to create a story outline. And I've tried doing this. Say, write me a story outline of a murder mystery story that's set in London in the 19th century in a church. And it will go and do that. It will write a story outline. And then you could then say, okay, now write me the first chapter of that story. And it will do it. You can then say, no, I don't like that. Write me another one. Or you could say, change this bit of the story outline. Or you could take the story outline it's written, tweak it a little bit, and then say, write me the chapter based on it. So you can start to use it a little like the sort of symbolic model that I mentioned. The other way is by doing turn taking. So you write the first sentence or the first paragraph, and then you hand it over to ChatGPT to write the next paragraph, and then you write another paragraph. And that's that flow state that I mentioned. What you're doing is using ChatGPT to continue that flow so that you never get writer's block. As soon as you, as a writer, get writer's block, you just hand it over to ChatGPT to write the next sentence or two, and then you carry on. And so it's a good way to just practice writing, to do some sort of writing exercises. And also for children, there's this idea that they have in their head, I think, that there's only just one story, there's one way of writing. With ChatGPT, it might take them off in a different direction, a way they hadn't expected, introduce a new character, a new setting. And so they can see that stories can continue in different ways. So the ways that you can work playfully with ChatGPT and language models. And one of the things I'm really interested in doing at the moment, more broadly than just story generation, is seeing how you can use generative AI as a playful tool in education for exploring stories, but also for playing simple games, as teachers, for generating different types of lesson plans. There are many ways that you can be quite playful and creative with language models. They can't explain what they're doing. They can't necessarily reflect on what they're doing. So you have to bring your own critical powers to that. But they can be a tool for creativity and a tool for playful engagement. They have their uses, but they're not models of human creativity in that sense.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot here. In 1993, you told a journalist that a computer would write a novel within 20 years, and that would have been 2013. So what do you think? It didn't happen. Would you make a prediction now?
So, yeah, well, it was fascinating back then. I had just given a talk about generative story writing, and to my surprise, I was taken after this talk into a room that was full of journalists, and they started firing questions at me like, are computers going to replace novelists? Are they going to do away with our jobs? And then one of them asked me, so when is a computer going to write a novel? And I said, well, not yet. And they said, well, is it going to be 20 years, 30 years? And I said, well, perhaps 20 years. And then next day, in the front page of a national newspaper, the researcher says computers are going to write a novel in 20 years. So that's how it happened. I think, yes, a computer now can write a novel. And I've given an idea of how you can do it with something with a program like ChatGPT. You can ask it to create a story structure and then write the novel chapter by chapter based on that story structure. You can do it, but it won't be very good. So large language models at the current state of the art are pretty good at doing mediocre tasks. So if you want, a mediocre story, a mediocre novel, I think it can do it now. Fan fiction, for example, it's pretty good at generating fan fiction. If you want it to generate another Star Wars novel, it can do that. But it's not going to generate the next great Charles Dickens or great novelist type novel because it doesn't have that deep understanding of the human experience. And it doesn't have a really deep understanding of how the world works. And also about what motivates people, what excites people. So it will write a bad novel. It will even write a mediocre novel now, but it's not going to write the next great novel. It's not going to be the next Emily Bronte.
Well, we're coming near the end of our time. Is there something you'd like to talk about that I haven't asked you yet?
I think I would just like to end that, we've been talking about the recent present, but there's a fascinating history of attempts to design mechanical machines that will be creative, and particularly around creative writing. So Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift wrote about a machine that could generate all the books in the world. Writers such as Walter Scott, George Orwell, Roald Dahl wrote short stories about mechanical story writers. And computer scientists have also been fascinated by this idea of a machine as a writer, and horrified also by the idea of a machine taking over creativity. So there's a fascinating prehistory going back to the 19th century and a clockwork poetry machine. And that's one of the areas that we explore in our book about story machines, how computers have become creative writers. I hadn't realized just that rich history of the attempts to build computational story devices. So we're still telling that bigger story about machines as creative opportunities, but also as creative threats to human creativity. And it's not the end of the story. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what's going to happen next and how, as humans, we can keep control of this technology so that we can bring human creativity to automated machine telling.
Well, Professor Mike Sharples, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a great conversation.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of your podcasts.
Professor Mike Sharples is a pioneer in artificial intelligence. Back in the 1970s, he was one of the first people to believe that computers might someday be capable of writing stories. Our conversation ranged widely from his studies of how professional authors write to how children learn to write, and to today's generative AI models like ChatGPT. Please visit his website, mikesharples.org, and take a look at his 2022 book called Story Machines. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.